A soldier surprised his daughter to walk her down the aisle on wedding day, and what happened next shocked everyone. He hadn't seen her in years. He missed birthdays, graduations, even the moment she said yes. But today, he came home to make things right. It should have been the happiest day of their lives, until the soldier realized the man waiting at the altar was the medic who once saved his life overseas. But when a long-buried truth comes to light, this wedding turns into something no one expected. A reckoning, a miracle, and a walk that changed every heart in the room. What secret could turn a wedding into a moment the world would never forget? And how far would a father go to finally come home? The Greyhound bus growled low as it climbed the winding stretch of Route 42, cutting through fields of wildflowers and forgotten farmhouses. The morning sun was just beginning to crack the horizon, spilling soft gold light across the glass. Inside, Colonel David Walker sat perfectly still by the window, hands folded around a small velvet box. He didn't move much these days unless he had to. The box was worn smooth at the edges, dark blue, faded to gray in places where his thumbs had rubbed the fabric thin. Inside it, nestled on ivory silk, was his late wife's wedding ring, a simple gold band with a tiny diamond that caught the light like a promise. David turned it over in his palm. The metal was cool, familiar. It still smelled faintly of her perfume, though he knew that was impossible. Some memories didn't fade. They just settled deeper. The bus hit a pothole, jostling him forward. He steadied himself with one hand on the seat in front of him. His knees ached. His back hurt. Small prices for a man who'd spent 30 years carrying gear through deserts and mountains. These days, the only thing he carried was regret. He slipped the box back into his jacket pocket and pressed his forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the landscape shifted from open farmland to clusters of trees, oak and pine, the kind that lined the roads of Maple Creek, his hometown, the place he'd left behind more times than he could count. David closed his eyes. He could see Hannah's face the last time he'd spoken to her. She'd been 23 then, standing in the doorway of her apartment with her arms crossed. Her voice had been calm, controlled, too controlled. "I don't need you to fix anything, Dad. I just need you to be here." But he hadn't been. Not when she graduated college. Not when she got her first teaching job. Not when she got engaged. He'd sent letters, cards, emails that went unanswered. She had every right to be angry. David opened his eyes and stared at his reflection in the window. Gray stubble, deep lines around his mouth, eyes that looked older than 62. He didn't recognize the man looking back. The letter from Rachel Miller was folded in his shirt pocket, read so many times the creases had softened to cloth. He pulled it out again, even though he'd memorized every word. "Colonel Walker, I know you don't know me well, but Hannah talks about you more than she realizes. She misses you. She won't say it, but I see it. Her wedding is in 3 days, and I think you should be there. She'll never see it coming, Colonel. Just be there on her wedding day. That's all you need to do." Rachel David folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into his pocket. Rachel had included the date, the time, and the name of the church. She'd even sent him money for the bus ticket, though he'd mailed it back with a note of thanks. He didn't need charity. He needed courage. The bus slowed as it rolled past the town's welcome sign. Maple Creek, population 4,200, where everyone belongs. David's throat tightened. The driver's voice crackled over the intercom. "Maple Creek, next stop." David grabbed his suitcase from the overhead rack. An old olive-green duffel bag with his name stenciled on the side. Everything he owned fit inside it. Clothes, toiletries, a Bible his wife had given him before his first deployment. He'd carried it through 3 wars and never once opened it until after she died. The bus hissed to a stop in front of the depot, a small brick building with a faded Coca-Cola sign hanging above the door. David stood, shoulders squared out of habit, and walked down the narrow aisle. The driver nodded at him. "Have a good one, sir." "You too," David said quietly. He stepped off the bus into the cool morning air. The smell hit him first, pine needles and rain-soaked earth, mixed with the faint sweetness of blooming lilacs. It was the smell of home. David set his duffel bag on the ground and looked around. The depot was empty, except for a stray cat curled up on a bench. The town hadn't changed much. Same storefronts, same brick sidewalks, same church steeple rising above the rooftops in the distance. His hands trembled as he zipped up his jacket. He could see the steeple clearly now, white paint gleaming in the early light. Somewhere inside that church, Hannah was getting ready, putting on her dress, laughing with her bridesmaids, living a moment he should have been part of years ago. David picked up his bag and started walking. His boots echoed on the pavement. One step, then another. The weight of the velvet box pressed against his chest with every breath. He stopped at the edge of the street and stared up at the steeple. His voice came out rough, barely a whisper. "I'm here, kiddo." Morning sunlight filtered through the canopy of maple trees that lined Main Street, casting dappled shadows across the brick sidewalks. David walked slowly, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, taking in every familiar corner of Maple Creek. The hardware store still had the same green awning. The barbershop pole still spun red and white. Even the bench outside the post office, where he'd proposed to Sarah 35 years ago, sat in the exact same spot, slightly weathered, but solid. An old man sweeping the sidewalk outside the pharmacy stopped mid-stroke and squinted at David. "Colonel Walker?" David nodded. "Morning, Mr. Henderson." The shopkeeper's face split into a wide grin. "Well, I'll be. Sarah's David." "You're back." "Yes, sir." "Hannah know you're here?" David shifted the weight of his bag. "Not yet." Mr. Henderson's smile softened. "She's going to lose her mind, son." "In the best way." David managed a small smile and kept walking. Word traveled fast in small towns. By the time he reached the corner of Oak and Third, Mrs. Chen from the flower shop was standing in her doorway, hand over her mouth. Two women having coffee at the cafe window pointed and whispered. A teenage boy on a bicycle slowed down, staring. The colonel's back. David kept his head down and walked faster. Mrs. Langford's inn sat at the end of Maple Street, a two-story Victorian house with white shutters and a wraparound porch. Roses climbed the lattice by the front steps, just like they had decades ago. David stopped at the gate, gripping the iron rail. This was where he'd brought Sarah after their wedding. They'd spent 3 days here, walking through town hand in hand, eating breakfast on the porch, talking about the life they'd build together. He pushed the gate open and climbed the steps. The front door swung wide before he could knock. Mrs. Langford stood in the doorway, smaller than he remembered, her white hair pinned in a neat bun. Her eyes went soft when she saw him. "David Walker," she said quietly. "I wondered if you'd come home." "Ma'am," he removed his cap. "I was hoping you might have a room available." She stepped aside without a word, gesturing him in. The inside smelled like lavender and old wood. The same grandfather clock ticked in the hallway. The same floral wallpaper lined the walls. "Room 3 is open," Mrs. Langford said. "Same one you and Sarah stayed in." David's chest tightened. "I appreciate it." She led him upstairs, her hand trailing along the banister. When she unlocked the door, David stepped inside and felt time collapse. The quilt on the bed, the lace curtains, the view of the garden through the window. It was all exactly the same. Mrs. Langford lingered in the doorway. "She talks about you, you know, Hannah. She comes by sometimes for tea. Always says she wishes you could see how the town's grown." David set his bag on the floor. "I should have come sooner." "Maybe," Mrs. Langford said gently. "But you're here now. That's what matters." She left him alone, pulling the door shut with a soft click. David sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his hands. That afternoon, David walked to the diner on Main Street. He ordered coffee and sat in a booth by the window, watching the town move around him. The walls were covered in framed photographs, local history, town events, familiar faces frozen in moments he'd missed. One photo caught his eye. Hannah stood in the center of a crowd, holding a trophy and wearing a cap and gown. The caption underneath read, "Hannah Walker receives state scholarship for excellence in counseling, class of 2018. David stood and walked closer, his coffee forgotten. She looked so much like her mother. Same bright eyes, same wide smile. She was surrounded by friends, her arm around an older woman David didn't recognize. He scanned the other photos. Hannah volunteering at a food drive. Hannah cutting the ribbon at the new community center. Hannah standing beside a tall man in a suit, both of them smiling at a veterans event. The waitress appeared beside him. "That's Hannah Walker, sweetest girl in town. Works at the middle school now, counseling kids. She's got a gift for it." David nodded slowly. "She's getting married tomorrow. To Michael Rivers. Good man. He runs a therapy practice for veterans over in Pine Ridge. They met at a fundraiser a few years back." The waitress smiled. "They're perfect together." David swallowed hard. "That's good. That's real good." He returned to his booth and finished his coffee in silence. Evening came soft and gold, the sky turning amber as the sun dipped low. David walked to the church at the edge of town, a small white building with a tall steeple and stained glass windows that glowed like jewels in the fading light. The front door stood open. David climbed the steps slowly and stopped just outside, peering in. The sanctuary was empty except for one person, Hannah. She stood alone at the altar, dressed in jeans and a sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She held a piece of paper in her hands, reading quietly to herself. Her lips moved, practicing words he couldn't hear. Then she stopped. Her shoulders shook slightly. She lifted one hand to her face, wiping her eyes. David's throat closed. He wanted to call out to her, to step inside, and tell her he was here, that he was sorry, that he'd never stopped thinking about her. But he didn't. Not yet. He stepped back into the shadows, his hand pressed against the doorframe. Hannah folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket. She stood there a moment longer, staring at the empty pews, then turned and walked toward the side exit. David waited until she was gone, then turned and walked back down the steps. His voice came out as a whisper, carried away by the evening breeze. Tomorrow. Sunrise broke over Maple Creek like a promise, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The church bells tolled softly across town, marking the beginning of the day. Hannah woke to sunlight streaming through her childhood bedroom window and the sound of laughter downstairs. She blinked, her heart racing with excitement and nerves, and stared up at the ceiling she'd stared at 1,000 times before. Today was the day. Footsteps thundered up the stairs, and her bedroom door burst open. Rachel appeared first, carrying a tray of coffee and pastries, followed by 3 other bridesmaids in matching robes. "The bride is awake," Rachel announced, setting the tray on the dresser. Hannah sat up, laughing as her friends swarmed around her. "What time is it?" "Time to make you the most beautiful bride Maple Creek has ever seen," said Amy, her college roommate. The room filled with chatter and movement, curling irons plugged in, makeup bags unzipped. Someone turned on music, and someone else started dancing. Hannah reached for her coffee, her hands trembling slightly. Rachel sat beside her on the bed. "You okay?" Hannah nodded. "Just nervous. Good nervous. Michael's gonna lose it when he sees you." Hannah smiled, but her eyes drifted to the old photograph on her dresser. Her parents on their wedding day, young and glowing, her father in his dress uniform. Rachel followed her gaze and squeezed her hand. Hannah looked away quickly. "Let's get started." Across town, David stood in front of the small mirror in his in-room, polishing his shoes with slow, deliberate strokes. His dress uniform hung on the closet door, perfectly pressed. The medals across the chest caught the morning light. He set down the cloth and studied his reflection. Gray hair, lines around his eyes, hands that had seen too much war and not enough grace. Would she even recognize him? He picked up the velvet box from the nightstand and opened it. Sarah's wedding ring gleamed inside, delicate and timeless. "Help me do this right," he whispered. A soft knock came at the door. David crossed the room and opened it. Rachel stood in the hallway, dressed in a pale blue bridesmaid dress, her eyes already glistening. "Colonel." "Rachel." He stepped aside. "Come in." She walked in and turned to face him, pressing one hand to her chest. "You clean up nice." David managed a small smile. "Thank you for everything you've done." "Don't thank me yet. You're going to make me cry before we even get to the church." She wiped her eyes quickly. "Okay, listen. Here's the plan. The ceremony starts at 11. The processional music starts right at 11:15. That's when you walk in." "Walk in?" David frowned. "I thought I'd just sit in the back." Rachel shook her head firmly. "No way. You walk in right after the music starts, down the center aisle. Everyone will see you. And Hannah," her voice broke, "she'll faint when she sees you." David's chest tightened. "I don't want to take attention away from her day." "David!" Rachel stepped closer, her voice gentle but fierce. "This is her day, and you being there is the only thing that's been missing." He looked down at the velvet box in his hands. Rachel noticed. "What's that?" "Her mother's wedding ring." David held it out. "I was hoping you could place it on the front pew for her, so she finds it later." Rachel took the box carefully, cradling it like something sacred. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "She's gonna lose it completely." "That's the idea." Rachel tucked the box into her small purse and hugged him quickly. 11:15. "Don't be late." "I won't." She left, and David stood alone again, his heart thudding harder now. Back at Hannah's house, the bridesmaids worked like a well-coordinated team, hair pinned in soft waves, makeup applied with gentle precision. The wedding dress hung like a cloud of white lace and silk. Hannah stood by the window, watching the town come alive below. Amy appeared beside her. "What you thinking about?" Hannah hesitated. "My dad." The room went quiet. Rachel looked up from adjusting her shoes. "What about him?" Hannah's voice came out small. "I just wish he could be here. I know that's stupid. He hasn't been around in years. But today—" She trailed off, wiping her eyes. "I keep thinking Mom would have wanted him to walk me down the aisle." Rachel exchanged a quick glance with the other bridesmaids and smiled softly. "Your mom's watching." "I'm sure of it." Hannah nodded and turned away from the window. "Okay, let's do this." David arrived at the church just after 10:30. Guests were beginning to gather, their voices mingling with birdsong and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. He slipped through the side entrance and found a seat in the very last pew, tucked into the corner where shadows gathered. The sanctuary filled slowly. Friends, neighbors, families in their Sunday best. Laughter echoed off the high ceilings. Children fidgeted in their seats. David watched it all, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Then the doors at the back of the church opened wider, and Hannah appeared. She stood framed in sunlight, radiant in white lace, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders. Her smile was nervous and beautiful. David's breath caught. She looked exactly like her mother. Hannah stepped forward, flanked by her bridesmaids, and the guests began to turn and gasp. David gripped the edge of the pew. The processional music hadn't started yet, but his daughter was here, and she had no idea he was too. The organ swelled to life, filling the sanctuary with rich, golden sound. The congregation rose as one, a wave of rustling fabric and hushed voices. Hannah stood at the entrance, her bouquet trembling in her hands, her smile radiant, despite the tears already forming in her eyes. Pastor Whitman stepped forward to the microphone, his warm voice carrying across the room. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." David stood. The movement was sudden, instinctive. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stepped into the center aisle. Gasps rippled through the church like wind through wheat. Heads turned. Whispers erupted. Someone said, "Is that—" Hannah froze mid-step, her eyes scanning the crowd in confusion. Then her gaze locked on him. The bouquet slipped from her hands. "Dad?" The word came out broken, barely a whisper. David's vision blurred with tears, but he kept walking, his shoes echoing on the hardwood floor. Hannah's face crumpled. She pressed one hand to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. Then she ran. Her dress billowed behind her as she rushed down the aisle, her bridesmaids gasping in surprise. She crashed into David's arms with such force he nearly stumbled backward. "Dad!" she sobbed into his chest. "You came! You actually came!" David wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, feeling the years of distance collapse between them. "Couldn't miss my girl's big day," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She pulled back just enough to look at him, tears streaming down her face. I thought you weren't." "I know." He cupped her face gently. "I'm sorry, Hannah. I'm so sorry." She threw her arms around him again, and the entire church erupted in applause. Guests wiped their eyes. Someone let out a whoop of joy. Rachel stood at the front, clutching a tissue, crying openly. For a few shining minutes, everything felt perfect. David held his daughter close, breathing in the scent of her perfume, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. This was the moment he'd dreamed of for years, the moment he thought he'd lost forever. Hannah finally pulled away, laughing through her tears. "You're really here." "I'm really here." She wiped her eyes, smudging her makeup. "I look terrible now." "You look beautiful." The bridesmaids rushed forward, dabbing at Hannah's face with tissues, fixing her hair. The crowd slowly settled back into their seats, still buzzing with emotion. David stepped aside, giving her space, his chest tight with gratitude. Then his gaze drifted forward, past the bridesmaids, past the groomsmen standing at attention, to the groom. Michael Rivers stood at the altar in a crisp gray suit, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes wide with shock. Recognition hit David like thunder. The square jaw, the steady eyes, the scar along his left temple. Michael was older now, broader in the shoulders, lines around his eyes. But David would know that face anywhere. The face of the medic who'd pulled him from a burning Humvee during his final deployment. The face he'd seen through smoke and blood and flames. The man who'd saved his life. David's breath caught. Michael stared back across the crowd, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and awe. Their eyes locked, and the noise of the church faded into silence. Hannah tugged David's sleeve gently. "Come on, Dad. Let's get you seated." David blinked, forcing himself to look away. "Of course." She led him to the front pew, squeezing his hand before returning to the entrance to restart the processional. David sat down, his hands gripping his knees, his mind racing. Michael Rivers, here, marrying his daughter. The ceremony proceeded in a blur. Hannah walked down the aisle again, this time without running. Vows were exchanged. Rings were placed. The pastor pronounced them husband and wife. David watched it all, clapping when everyone else clapped, smiling when everyone else smiled, but his eyes kept drifting back to Michael. When the ceremony ended, and the guests moved to the reception hall for the pre-dinner gathering, David found himself standing near the punch bowl, his hands shaking slightly as he held a glass. "Colonel Walker." David turned. Michael stood behind him, still in his suit, his expression careful but warm. David set down his glass. "Michael." They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Michael extended his hand. "Never thought we'd meet again, sir." David took it, gripping firmly. Michael's handshake was steady, strong, just like it had been all those years ago when he dragged David from the wreckage. "Neither did I," David said quietly. Michael's voice trembled slightly. "I didn't know Hannah was your daughter." "She never mentioned—" "She wouldn't have," David interrupted gently. "We haven't spoken much over the years." Michael nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. "I'm glad you're here now." "So am I." They released hands, and an awkward silence settled between them. Michael shifted his weight. "Sir, I just want you to know. What happened that day?" David held up a hand. "You saved my life. That's all I need to know." Michael's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to say more, but instead, he just nodded. "Thank you, sir." He turned and walked back toward Hannah, who was laughing with her bridesmaids across the room. David watched them go, his chest tight. He'd come here to surprise his daughter, to walk her down the aisle, to give her the gift of his presence after years of absence. He hadn't expected this. The afternoon sun slanted through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the wooden floors. Guests filled the pews, their voices a gentle murmur of excitement. Bridesmaids rushed past David in a flurry of burgundy satin, adjusting bouquets, checking lipstick one last time. David stood near the back hallway, straightening his tie in a small mirror. His hands still trembled slightly. He'd walked countless dangerous paths in his lifetime, faced enemy fire without flinching, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Walking his daughter down the aisle, he checked his watch. 5 minutes until the processional. Down the hall, a door stood half open. Soft light spilled from the bridal suite. David turned toward it, meaning to check if Hannah needed anything, when he heard voices. "Michael, what is it?" Hannah's voice, concerned. "You've been quiet all morning." David froze mid-step. "Before we marry," Michael said, his voice shaking, "you deserve to know the truth about your father's last mission." David's breath caught. His hand gripped the wall. "What truth?" Hannah asked. A long pause. David could hear Michael pacing, footsteps heavy on the hardwood. "There's something I've hidden," Michael finally said. "About the friend who died that day. Your father's best friend." Hannah's voice went soft. "Sergeant Martinez?" "Yes." Michael exhaled shakily. "Hannah, what happened that day? It wasn't how the reports made it sound. The friend who died, he wasn't saving me by chance." Silence. David leaned closer to the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. The hallway suddenly felt too narrow, the air too thin. "I don't understand," Hannah whispered. Michael's voice cracked. "The mission went wrong. We were ambushed. Your father got separated from the convoy. Martinez and I found him trapped in the Humvee. It was already burning." David closed his eyes, memories flooding back. Smoke, heat, the acrid smell of fuel. "Martinez pulled your father out first," Michael continued. "But then—" He stopped, his voice breaking completely. "Michael, what happened?" "Martinez went back in." Hannah gasped softly. "He went back in," Michael repeated, stronger now. "Because I told him there might be classified documents in the wreckage. Intelligence we couldn't let fall into enemy hands. Your father was unconscious. He didn't know. Martinez made the choice to go back." David's chest constricted. The world tilted. "No, the IED went off while he was inside," Michael said quietly. "He never made it out." Hannah's voice came out strangled. You mean my father wasn't the hero they said?" The silence that followed was deafening. David gripped the wall harder, his knuckles white. Blood roared in his ears. "Hannah, your father is a hero," Michael said firmly. "He served with honor for decades. But that day, that specific day, Martinez made the ultimate sacrifice. Not to save me, to protect classified intel that could have gotten more soldiers killed. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Hannah's voice shook with tears. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was ordered not to. And because—" Michael's voice dropped. "Because I've been carrying the guilt ever since. I'm the one who sent Martinez back in. I'm the reason he's dead." A choked sob escaped Hannah. David stood frozen in the hallway, his entire body numb. Martinez hadn't died saving him. Martinez had died on an order from the man who was about to marry his daughter. The organ music swelled suddenly from the sanctuary, the opening notes of the processional. David straightened quickly, stepping back from the door just as it swung open. Hannah emerged, her face pale, her eyes red and wet. She wore her veil, but her hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet. Their eyes met. David's throat tightened. He forced himself to smile, pretending he'd heard nothing, pretending his world hadn't just shattered. He straightened his tie one final time and offered his arm. "Ready, sweetheart?" Hannah stared at him, her lip quivering. Her gaze searched his face. Looking for what? He didn't know. Truth? Answers? Reassurance? He kept his expression steady, calm. The mask he'd worn through 1,000 difficult moments. Hannah hesitated. The organ music swelled louder. Guests were standing now, waiting. Finally, she took his arm. Her hand shook against his sleeve. David covered it with his own, squeezing gently. "It's going to be okay," he whispered. She nodded, but tears slipped down her cheeks. Together, they walked toward the sanctuary doors. The music rose, the guests turned, and the wedding began under a cloud of unspoken truth. The sanctuary doors opened. Every head turned. Hannah walked beside her father, her hand trembling on his arm. The organ music swelled, filling the church with warmth and light. Guests smiled through tears. Cameras flashed. But David felt her hesitation with every step. They moved slowly down the burgundy carpet runner, past pews filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Langford dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Rachel stood at the altar, beaming. Michael waited at the front, his expression torn between joy and anguish. Hannah's grip on David's arm tightened. They reached the halfway point. She stopped. David glanced at her. "Hannah?" Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Her bouquet shook in her free hand. The music continued, but whispers rippled through the crowd. "What's happening? Is she okay?" The pastor stepped forward slightly, concern crossing his weathered face. Hannah's tears came suddenly, streaming down her cheeks. She shook her head, the veil trembling. "I can't," she whispered. "Sweetheart," David started. "I can't." She pulled away from him and rushed back down the aisle, her dress trailing behind her. Gasps echoed through the sanctuary. "Hannah!" Michael called out, moving toward her. But she was already gone, the side door swinging shut behind her. Michael followed without hesitation, his dress shoes echoing against the hardwood. The congregation erupted into confused murmurs. David stood frozen in the aisle, his arm still extended where Hannah had been. His mind reeled, his heart hammered. Pastor Whitman raised his hands gently. "Let's take a brief recess," he said calmly. "Everyone, please remain seated. We'll sort this out." David's legs felt heavy as he walked back down the aisle. Guests watched him pass, their expressions full of pity and confusion. He pushed through the side door. Outside, the late afternoon sun blazed hot against the concrete steps. Hannah stood near the garden pathway, her dress brilliant white against the green hedges. Michael reached for her. "Hannah, please." She whirled on him. "You lied to me." "I didn't lie. You kept the truth from me." Her voice cracked. "For how long, Michael? How long have you known what really happened?" Michael's face crumpled. "Since the day it happened." Hannah's hands flew to her mouth. "I was ordered to keep quiet," Michael said desperately. "Classified mission. National security. I couldn't tell anyone. Not you. Not your father. Not. Don't." Hannah stepped back. "Don't hide behind orders." Michael's shoulders sagged. "You're right. I should have told you the moment we got serious. But I was afraid." His voice broke. I was afraid you'd look at me exactly the way you're looking at me right now." Hannah wiped her tears roughly. "Tell me the truth. All of it." Michael took a shaky breath. "Your father's friend, Sergeant Martinez. He didn't die saving me by accident. He made a choice. He ran back into that burning Humvee because I told him there might be classified intel inside. Intelligence that couldn't fall into enemy hands." Hannah's face went pale. "The IED went off while I was inside," Michael continued, his voice hollow. "He died instantly. Your father was already unconscious. He never knew Martinez went back in. He never knew it was my order that killed him." "Oh, God," Hannah whispered. "I've carried that guilt every single day since," Michael said. "That's why I became a therapist. Why I work with veterans. I thought if I could help enough people, maybe I could make up for—" "You can't bring him back," Hannah said sharply. "I know. You can't erase what happened." "I know." Hannah's chest heaved with sobs. "And you were going to marry me without ever telling me the truth?" "I was going to tell you," Michael insisted. "Today, before the ceremony. That's what I was doing when my father showed up," Hannah finished bitterly. She turned away, her hands covering her face. The garden door creaked open. David stepped outside, his expression carefully neutral. His eyes took in the scene. Hannah crying, Michael devastated, the bouquet lying forgotten on a stone bench. Hannah heard his footsteps and turned. Their eyes met. "Is it true?" Her voice came out raw. "Did you really not know? Did Martinez die because of an order, not because he was saving you?" David's jaw tightened. "Answer me," Hannah demanded, her voice rising. "Did Mom die waiting for a hero who never came home?" The words hung in the air like smoke. David stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his face carved from stone. He said nothing, because silence was easier than confession. Evening light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the empty sanctuary in shades of amber and rose. David sat alone in the front pew, elbows on his knees, head bowed. The church was silent now. The guests had dispersed to the reception hall, then gradually filtered away when it became clear there would be no celebration. Covered dishes sat untouched on folding tables in the fellowship room. The wedding cake, 3 tiers of white frosting and delicate sugar flowers, remained uncut beneath the pavilion outside. David stared at the velvet box in his hands. His wife's wedding ring caught the fading light. He should have stayed away. The side door banged open. Hannah stormed in, still wearing her wedding dress. She'd torn off the veil. Mascara streaked her cheeks. "I want answers," she said, her voice echoing through the sanctuary. David stood slowly, turning to face her. "Hannah!" "Don't." She held up a hand. "Don't you dare Hannah me like everything's fine." He said nothing. She walked toward him, her footsteps sharp against the tile. "Where were you?" "What do you mean?" "Where were you when I turned 16? Her voice cracked. "Where were you when I graduated high school? When I got accepted to college? When I got my first job?" She stopped a few feet away, trembling. "Where were you when Mom died?" David's throat tightened. "I was overseas," Hannah finished bitterly. "Always overseas. Always somewhere else. Anywhere but here." "I came back," he said quietly. "Your body came back," Hannah shot back. "But you weren't in it. You walked through this house like a ghost for 6 months. Then you left again. You didn't even say goodbye." David's hands clenched around the velvet box. "I was 12 years old," Hannah continued, tears streaming freely now. "I needed my father. And you disappeared." "I couldn't." David's voice broke. He cleared his throat. Tried again. "I couldn't face this place." "Why not?" "Because every corner of this town reminded me of what I'd lost." The words came out rough, jagged. "Your mother. My friend. The life I was supposed to have." Hannah wiped her eyes angrily. "So you ran?" "Yes. You abandoned me." Yes. The admission hung between them like a physical thing. Hannah's face crumpled. I needed you, she whispered. I was grieving too. But you left me alone. David took a step toward her. I know. You don't know. Hannah's voice rose again. You don't know what it's like to watch your mother die while your father is halfway across the world. You don't know what it's like to stand at her grave alone because he couldn't be bothered to come home in time for the funeral. I tried. Not hard enough, she was shouting now, her whole body shaking. Nothing was ever hard enough for you to choose me over your guilt. The sanctuary door opened quietly. Michael stepped inside, still in his tuxedo. His tie was loosened, his face drawn. Hannah, he said gently. She spun on him. Don't. I just thought. You thought what? That you could fix this? Hannah laughed, a bitter, broken sound. You two built your lives around a lie. You, she pointed at Michael, buried yourself in guilt over a man you couldn't save. And you, she turned back to David, buried yourself in shame over a daughter you wouldn't face. Michael moved closer. That's not fair. Fair? Hannah's voice cracked. What's fair about any of this? The pastor appeared in the doorway, his expression somber. He looked at the three of them, Hannah in her ruined dress, Michael hovering uncertainly, David standing rigid with grief. Perhaps, Pastor Whitman said quietly, some privacy would be best. He stepped back into the hallway. Moments later, his voice drifted through the open door as he gently suggested the remaining guests give the family space. Thunder rumbled in the distance. David looked at his daughter, really looked at her. Her mother's eyes, her mother's stubbornness, her mother's capacity for love, now twisted into pain. Because of him. I'm sorry, he whispered. The words were too small, too late. Hannah turned away, fresh tears falling. David set the velvet box on the pew. His hands felt empty without it. His whole chest felt empty. He walked past Michael without meeting his eyes, past Hannah, who didn't turn to watch him go, out the side door, into the gathering storm. Rain began to fall as David stepped off the church steps. Slow at first, then faster. Fat drops splattered against the sidewalk, darkening the concrete. He walked with his shoulders hunched, heading toward the inn. The town square was empty, shopkeepers closing up early against the weather. Thunder rolled overhead. David didn't look back. Inside the church, Rachel Miller stood in the back pew, where she'd been watching the whole scene unfold. Tears streamed down her face. In her hands, she clutched an envelope. The letter David had given her that morning, the one he'd asked her to place in Hannah's bouquet after the ceremony, the letter that was supposed to explain everything. Rachel looked down at it, then toward the door where David had disappeared into the rain. Her hands trembled as fresh tears fell, spotting the paper. Rain battered the windows of Hannah's childhood home. The sound was relentless, a drumming that matched the ache in her chest. She sat at her dresser, still in her wedding dress. The fabric felt heavy now, suffocating. Her makeup was smudged beyond repair, mascara tracks dried, and fresh tears mixed together on her cheeks. The dress hung by the mirror like a ghost of what the day was supposed to be. Hannah stared at her reflection. She barely recognized herself. A knock came at the door downstairs. She didn't move. Another knock, more insistent. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Her aunt, staying to help clean up. Voices murmured below. Then footsteps on the stairs. Hannah? Her aunt's voice, gentle. Rachel's here. Hannah closed her eyes. Tell her I can't. She says it's important. A pause. Then Hannah heard Rachel's voice, urgent but quiet. Please. Hannah stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She opened the bedroom door. Rachel stood in the hallway, absolutely soaked. Her hair plastered to her face, her jacket dripping water onto the hardwood floor. She held something against her chest. A white envelope, protected inside her jacket. You're drenched, Hannah said flatly. Rachel stepped forward. He wanted you to have this. She pulled out the envelope. It was sealed, slightly yellowed with age. Hannah's name was written across the front in her father's distinctive handwriting. Hannah stared at it. "What is it?" "A letter." Rachel's voice cracked. "He wrote it years ago. Gave it to a chaplain to deliver if—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "If he didn't make it home." Hannah's hands trembled as she took the envelope. "He asked me to put it in your bouquet this morning," Rachel continued. "After the ceremony. But then, everything—" She trailed off. Hannah looked down at the envelope. The paper was soft, worn at the edges. It had been carried across continents, through war zones, kept safe by people who understood its weight. "I'll leave you alone," Rachel whispered. She squeezed Hannah's shoulder, then turned and disappeared back down the stairs. Hannah stood in the hallway for a long moment, the envelope feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. Then she went back into her room and closed the door. Hannah sat on the edge of her bed. Rain continued to hammer the windows. Thunder rumbled somewhere far away. She stared at the envelope. Her name, written in her father's hand. The ink slightly faded but still clear. Her fingers shook as she carefully opened the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was her father's, but younger somehow, less weathered. Written in the careful script of someone who knew these might be his last words. "My dearest Hannah, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home the way I promised. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for so many things." Hannah's vision blurred immediately. She blinked hard, forcing herself to keep reading. "I know I've missed too much already. Your 12th birthday, your first day of middle school, the science fair where you built that volcano that actually worked. Your mother sent me pictures. I keep them in my pocket. Every day I'm away, I think about what I'm missing. Every sunrise I see. And there are beautiful ones here, Hannah, the kind that paint the whole sky orange and pink. Every single one is a wish for your happiness. I pray you're laughing. I pray you're safe. I pray you know how much your mother and I love you, even when I'm too far away to show it." A sob broke through Hannah's chest. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming freely now. "I'm not good at this, at being gone, at missing the moments that matter. Your mother was always better at the everyday stuff, the homework help and the bedtime stories. I was always better at leaving. But I want you to know something. Wherever I am, whatever happens, I'll be thinking of you, hoping for you, cheering for you from whatever corner of the world I'm in. And someday, when you walk down the aisle on your wedding day, I'll be there, even if it's only in spirit, even if I'm just a memory you carry with you. I'll walk beside you, Hannah. I promise." Hannah couldn't breathe. The words swam on the page. Be happy. Be brave. Be everything your mother and I always knew you could be. I love you more than all the sunrises I've ever seen. Dad. The letter fell from her hands onto the bedspread. Hannah buried her face in her palms and wept, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. All this time, all these years, he'd carried this letter, waiting for the right moment, or the worst moment, waiting to tell her what he couldn't say in person. Hannah's breath came in gasps. She picked up the letter again, reading it through tears. I'll walk beside you, Hannah. I promise. He'd come home. He'd kept his promise, and she'd sent him away. Thunder cracked overhead, loud enough to rattle the windows. Hannah stood abruptly. She grabbed her coat from the chair, threw it over her wedding dress. Her hands fumbled with the zipper. She had to find him. She had to tell him. What? That she was sorry? That she understood? That she forgave him? All of it. Everything. Hannah rushed out of the bedroom, down the stairs. Her aunt called after her, but Hannah didn't stop. She flung open the front door and ran into the rain. The bedroom sat empty. On the vanity, the letter lay open beside the mirror. Rain from the window had started to seep through the old frame, drops of water falling onto the dresser. One landed on the paper, then another. The ink began to blur at the edges, her father's careful handwriting bleeding slowly into the aged paper. "I'll walk beside you, Hannah, I promise." Rain poured over Maple Creek's old wooden bridge. The downpour was relentless, turning the dirt paths to mud and sending small rivers down the cobblestone streets. David stood beneath a street lamp at the bridge's edge. Water streamed off his jacket, soaking through to his shirt. He didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on the memorial wall, a granite structure built into the bridge's stone foundation. Bronze plaques lined the surface, each one bearing the name of a soldier from Maple Creek who never came home. His friend's name was there. Third row from the bottom, right side. Sergeant Thomas Tommy Brennan, 1978, 2019. He gave his life for his brothers. David's jaw clenched. His hands hung at his sides, one still holding the small velvet box. Thunder rolled overhead. He'd stood in front of that plaque before, once, right after he'd been discharged. He'd come home just long enough to attend the memorial service, then left again 3 days later. Couldn't bear to stay. Couldn't bear to face Hannah with this weight on his shoulders. Tommy had 2 kids, a wife, a whole life waiting for him. And David had lived. "Dad!" The voice cut through the rain. David's head turned sharply. Hannah stood at the other end of the bridge, soaked to the bone. Her coat hung open over her wedding dress, the white fabric plastered to her legs. Her hair clung to her face in dark strands. She was breathing hard, like she'd been running. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain drummed against the wooden planks between them. Then Hannah walked forward slowly, her shoes splashing through puddles. She stopped a few feet away from him. They stood in silence. The only sound was the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Hannah's eyes were red from crying. Her makeup was completely gone now, washed away by rain and tears. She looked at the memorial wall, then back at her father. "Why didn't you come home sooner?" Her voice was quiet, barely audible over the storm. David's chest rose and fell. He looked down at the velvet box in his hand. "Because I didn't know how to face what I left undone," he said softly. Hannah's brow furrowed. "What you left?" "Your mother." His voice cracked. "She died waiting for me to come home. And I wasn't there. I chose this." He gestured toward the memorial. "Over her. Over you." "Dad, you didn't choose." "I did." He looked at her now, eyes glistening. "Every deployment. Every extension. Every time I told her, just one more tour. I chose the mission over being home. And when Tommy died saving me." He stopped, his throat working. "I didn't deserve to walk back through that door." Rain ran down his face. "Your mother begged me to come home after that mission," he continued. "Said she was sick, said she needed me. And I told her I'd come after the medical leave cleared. After the paperwork, after everything was settled." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "She died 3 weeks later." Hannah's hand came up to her mouth. "I couldn't face you," David said. "Couldn't look you in the eye, knowing I chose this over being there when she needed me most. When you needed me most." A sob escaped Hannah's throat. David's gaze dropped back to the velvet box. He turned it over in his palm, the wet velvet dark under the street lamp. "I only came now because of a promise," he said quietly. "I told your mother I'd walk you down the aisle someday, that I'd give you her ring when you found the right man." He looked up at Hannah. "I came to keep that promise, to walk you halfway, in her place, then let you go." He opened his hand, showing her the box. "This was supposed to be on the pew for you to find after the ceremony," he said. "I didn't mean to ruin anything. I just wanted to honor her. And you." Hannah stared at the box. Then her eyes moved back to her father's face. She stepped forward. Rain streamed between them. Slowly, she reached out and covered his hand with hers, the velvet box pressed between their palms. "Then walk me, Dad," she whispered. David's breath caught. "The rest of the way," Hannah continued, her voice stronger now, "we'll figure out together." David's hand closed gently around Hannah's. They stood there for a moment longer beneath the street lamp. Rain still falling, but softer now. The storm was passing. "Come on," Hannah whispered. "Let's go back." David nodded slowly. He slipped the velvet box into his jacket pocket and let her lead him forward. They walked hand in hand back across the bridge, their footsteps echoing on the wet wooden planks. The rain eased into a drizzle, misting around them like a veil lifting. The church glowed in the distance, its stained glass windows casting colored light onto the wet pavement. One by one, cars began pulling back into the parking lot. Guests emerged with umbrellas, glancing toward the bridge, whispering, "They're coming back," someone murmured. "The bride and her father. They're coming." Hannah kept her eyes forward, her grip on David's hand firm. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound their shoes splashing through shallow puddles. The town square was quiet, except for the drip of water from awnings and the distant murmur of voices at the church. David cleared his throat. "Your mother's final wish," he began quietly, "was for us to forgive each other." Hannah glanced at him, but didn't speak. "She knew I'd carry the guilt," David continued, "knew I'd blame myself for not being there. And she knew you'd be angry with me for all the years I was gone." He paused, his voice thick. "She made me promise, in one of her last letters, that I'd come home someday and tell you the truth." "What truth?" Hannah asked softly. "That I loved you more than anything," David said, "even when I couldn't show it, even when I was too broken to be the father you deserved." He looked down at their joined hands. "She said you'd understand someday, that you'd forgive me when the time was right." Hannah's eyes brimmed with fresh tears. "I thought I'd lost you long before the war," she whispered. "All those years you were deployed. It felt like you were already gone." David stopped walking. He turned to face her, his weathered face creased with pain. "You didn't," he said firmly. Hannah's breath hitched. "You just had to wait until I found my courage again." He reached up and gently touched her cheek. "Real courage isn't facing bullets, kiddo. It's facing the people you love when you know you've let them down." A sob escaped Hannah's throat. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his wet jacket. David held her tightly, one hand cradling the back of her head like he used to when she was small. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there." "You're here now," Hannah choked out. "That's what matters." They stood there in the middle of the street, holding each other as the last of the rain fell around them. Finally, Hannah pulled back, wiping her eyes. She managed a trembling smile. "Mom would have hated that I'm ruining my makeup." David laughed. A real laugh, rough and broken, but genuine. "She would have said you look beautiful no matter what." Hannah squeezed his hand. "Let's finish this, Dad." Together. They walked the final stretch toward the church. The drizzle stopped completely now, leaving only the clean smell of rain-soaked earth and pine. As they reached the church steps, the double doors stood open. Warm light spilled out onto the wet stone, and there, standing just inside the doorway, was Michael. He was drenched. His suit jacket clung to his shoulders. His hair was plastered to his forehead, but his eyes were steady, hopeful, fixed on Hannah. David felt Hannah's hand tighten in his. They climbed the steps slowly. Hannah's dress left a trail of water on the stone. When they reached the top, David stopped. He looked at Michael. Really looked at him. The young man who'd pulled him from a burning vehicle years ago. The man who'd carried the weight of Tommy's death ever since. The man who loved his daughter enough to tell her the truth, even knowing it might cost him everything. David released Hannah's hand. He stepped forward and extended his hand to Michael. Michael took it, his grip firm despite the tremor in his fingers. "You saved my life once, son," David said quietly. Michael's throat worked. "Sir, I—" David shook his head, cutting him off. He glanced back at Hannah, then returned his gaze to Michael. "Maybe now it's time to save hers." Michael's eyes widened. His breath caught. Hannah moved forward, stepping between them. She looked at Michael, then at her father. David nodded once, a small gesture of permission, of blessing. Michael's face crumpled with relief. He reached for Hannah's hand. She took it. The church doors opened wide. Hannah and David stepped inside together. The guests rose as one, the rustle of fabric filling the sanctuary. Candles flickered along the windowsills and at the altar, casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. The overhead lights had been dimmed, leaving only soft golden light that made everything feel sacred. Hushed. Pastor Whitman stood at the front, his gentle face creased with emotion. Michael waited beside him, hands clasped, eyes locked on Hannah. The organ began to play, softly at first, then swelling into something beautiful and triumphant. Hannah's wet dress left a faint trail on the carpet. Her makeup was smudged, her hair damp and curling at the edges, but she walked with her head high, her hand secure in her father's. David kept his eyes forward, his steps measured and steady. Military discipline held him upright, but his hand trembled slightly where Hannah held it. They passed rows of familiar faces. Mrs. Langford dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Rachel stood near the front, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. Old veterans in the back pews straightened, some raising their hands to their hearts. The aisle stretched before them, each step bringing them closer to the altar, closer to Michael, closer to the future. Hannah's breathing steadied as they walked. David glanced at her once, and she squeezed his hand in response. They reached the halfway point. Hannah stopped. David looked at her, confused. The music continued, but the guests murmured softly. Hannah released her father's hand. She reached up and carefully unpinned her veil. The delicate lace her mother had worn decades ago, the same veil that had been stored in tissue paper and lavender for all these years. She held it in both hands for a moment, studying it. Then she turned to David. "This is for Mom," she said, her voice clear enough for the first few rows to hear. She placed the veil gently into his hands. David's breath caught. His fingers closed around the lace, trembling. Hannah's eyes glistened. She raised her voice slightly, addressing the entire congregation now. "And for every father who found his way home." A sob broke from someone in the third row. Then another. Within moments, half the guests were wiping their eyes. David stared down at the veil, his vision blurring. The lace was soft against his calloused palms, fragile, precious, impossibly light. Hannah touched his cheek. "Thank you for coming back, Dad." David couldn't speak. He nodded, clutching the veil to his chest, like a lifeline. Hannah turned and walked the rest of the way alone. She climbed the 3 steps to the altar and took her place beside Michael. He reached for her hand immediately, his own eyes red-rimmed. Pastor Whitman cleared his throat softly. He waited until the sniffling subsided, until the sanctuary fell quiet again. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice gentle but strong, "we are gathered here today, not just to witness a union, but to witness grace." The guests leaned forward slightly. "Life," Pastor Whitman continued, "has a way of breaking us, of scattering the pieces we thought were whole. But God's love, true love, gathers those pieces and makes something new, something beautiful." He looked at Michael and Hannah. "You two have walked through fire to stand here, and you've chosen, even in the midst of pain, to choose each other." Michael nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. Pastor Whitman smiled. "Now, I believe you've prepared your own vows." Michael turned to face Hannah fully. He took both her hands in his. "Hannah," he began, his voice rough, "I came into your life carrying a secret I thought would protect you. But secrets don't protect. They separate." He swallowed hard. I promise you, from this day forward, I'll never let silence stand between us again. I'll tell you the truth, even when it's hard. I'll hold your hand through every storm, and I'll spend the rest of my life earning the trust you've given me today." Tears slipped down Hannah's cheeks, but she smiled. She squeezed his hands. "Michael, you taught me that love isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. It's about showing up, even when you're scared." Her voice wavered. "You saved my father's life once, and today, you saved mine, by telling me the truth when it mattered most. I promise to walk beside you with faith and forgiveness, to build a life with you that honors the people we've lost and the people we've become." Michael's eyes closed briefly. When he opened them, they shone with tears. Pastor Whitman's voice was soft. "By the authority vested in me, and in the presence of God and these witnesses, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He paused, smiling. "You may kiss your bride." Michael pulled Hannah close and kissed her gently. The congregation erupted in applause. Hannah broke the kiss, laughing and crying at the same time. But instead of turning to face the guests, she stepped back down the altar steps. She walked straight to her father. David stood frozen in the front pew, still clutching her mother's veil. Hannah threw her arms around him. David held her tightly, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I love you, Dad," she whispered against his shoulder. "I love you too, kiddo," he choked out. The organ swelled, triumphant and joyful. Outside, the clouds broke apart. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, painting the sanctuary in brilliant reds, blues, and golds. The sun hung warm and golden over Maple Creek, casting long shadows across the grass near the old wooden bridge. A week had passed since the wedding, and the air felt lighter somehow, cleaner, like the rain had washed away more than just dust. Tables covered with checkered cloths dotted the riverbank. Guests milled about with paper plates and lemonade, their laughter mixing with the gentle rush of water below. Children chased each other near the memorial plaques, their shrieks of joy echoing off the trees. Hannah sat on a blanket beside Michael, her hand resting comfortably in his. She wore a simple sundress, her hair loose around her shoulders. The tension that had lived in her face for so long was gone. Near the bridge railing, David stood with Michael's father and several other veterans. They'd gathered around a wooden easel covered by a white sheet. David cleared his throat and tapped a fork against his glass. The conversations quieted. People turned to face him. "Thank you all for coming," David said, his voice carrying across the gathering. "A week ago, my daughter got married in that church up the hill. And in the middle of that ceremony, I learned something important." He paused, glancing at Hannah. She smiled encouragingly. "I learned that healing doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we speak the truth, when we face what we've lost, and when we choose to honor it by helping others." He gestured to Michael, who stood and joined him by the easel. "This young man saved my life overseas," David continued, "and he spent years trying to save others, veterans struggling with wounds nobody can see. Today, we're making that mission official." Michael reached for the sheet. Together, they pulled it away. A painted wooden sign stood beneath, the letters bold and clear. "The Jackson Memorial Veterans Foundation, supporting those who served." Beneath the name was a photograph of a young soldier in uniform smiling at the camera. David's friend, the man who'd run back into the fire. Applause broke out across the picnic area. David's eyes misted, but he kept his composure. Jackson deserves to be remembered, and every veteran who comes home carrying weight they can't put down. They deserve support, a place to talk, a community that understands. Michael stepped forward. "We'll be offering free counseling, group sessions, and emergency support for veterans and their families, because nobody should have to heal alone." More applause. A few veterans in the crowd nodded, their expressions grateful. Hannah rose from her blanket and walked over. She hugged her father tightly, then Michael. As the crowd began to mingle again, a woman in a pressed blazer approached, with a cameraman trailing behind her. She had a press badge clipped to her collar and carried a small microphone. "Colonel Walker?" she asked, extending her hand. "I'm Lisa Chen from Channel 7 News. Would you mind if we filmed a quick interview? This is exactly the kind of story people need to hear." David hesitated, glancing at Hannah. She nodded. "Tell them, Dad." David straightened his shoulders. "All right." Lisa positioned him near the memorial plaques, the river sparkling behind him. The cameraman adjusted his lens and gave a thumbs up. "Colonel Walker," Lisa began, "a week ago, you surprised your daughter at her wedding after years away. Can you tell us what brought you home?" David's jaw worked for a moment. "Love," he said simply, "and the courage to admit I'd been running from it." Lisa's expression softened. "Your daughter's wedding video has been shared thousands of times online already. People are calling it the most beautiful moment they've ever seen. What do you hope people take away from your story?" David looked past the camera, toward Hannah and Michael standing together near the foundation sign. "That it's never too late to come home," he said quietly. "Not to a place, but to the people who matter. And that forgiveness, it's not something you earn. It's something you receive, if you're brave enough to ask for it." Lisa smiled, blinking rapidly. Even the cameraman looked emotional. "Thank you, Colonel," she said. "I think a lot of people are going to be inspired by this." The interview wrapped, and Lisa shook hands with both David and Michael before heading back to her van. Hannah appeared at her father's side, carrying a rolled canvas banner. "Ready to hang the first one?" David took one end of the banner. Together, they walked to the bridge railing where 2 metal hooks had been installed earlier that morning. They unrolled it carefully. The banner matched the sign, bold letters announcing the foundation's name and purpose, with Jackson's photograph at the center. David secured his end first, then helped Hannah fasten hers. They stepped back, admiring it. The banner snapped gently in the breeze, visible to anyone crossing the bridge or walking the river path. "He'd be proud," Hannah said softly. David nodded. "Your mother, too." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. David drove alone to the cemetery on the hill overlooking town. He parked near the entrance and walked the familiar path, a small bouquet of white lilies in one hand and the velvet box in the other. His wife's grave sat beneath an old oak tree, the headstone simple but elegant. "Margaret Ann Walker, beloved wife, and mother forever in our hearts." A small American flag stood planted in the earth beside it, the fabric faded but intact. David knelt slowly, his knees protesting. He placed the lilies at the base of the stone, arranging them carefully. Then he opened the velvet box. The wedding ring gleamed in the fading light, simple gold, worn smooth by years of wear. He lifted it gently and set it atop the headstone, centering it above her name. For a long moment, he simply looked at it. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mission complete, sweetheart." His throat tightened. "She's not walking alone anymore." The breeze picked up, rustling the oak leaves overhead. The flag beside Margaret's grave fluttered softly, its stars and stripes catching the last rays of sunlight. David stayed there until the sky turned purple, until the first stars appeared overhead. Then he rose, touched the headstone once more, and walked back toward his car. Behind him, the flag continued to wave, gentle, steady, eternal. I hope you enjoyed that story. Make sure to like and subscribe so that you do not miss out on tomorrow's story. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy.